Hello, everyone. Today we're talking about alternative news styles, which includes Chapter 6, podcasting and digital audio recording. So, before we get into some of the alternative styles, first I wanted to talk about news versus information. When we talk about news, news is where you're looking for all sides of a story, good and bad, and you're including that information for your audience along with possibly opinions that have been shared by people you interviewed or by other sources so that your audience can review these opinions and also facts that you give them and come to their own conclusion about what's going on. Now, this is different from what's called a news mirage, which is a biased story, often written by public relations teams or advertisers that are presenting their work as news. And a news mirage has an agenda. There is a point that they are trying to accomplish by publishing this story. Sometimes it's to make their company look good, or it's to maybe change your opinion about a particular topic, as opposed to giving you the information and letting you come to your own conclusion. And finally, let's talk about a news desert. So, a news desert is an area lacking in local news reporting agencies. So, this means there are no longer independent local news agencies who are capable of covering local stories from that type of geographic angle. And instead, maybe there are one or two publications that are a national level, or possibly but there aren't any people to cover it, or there are possibly no news groups left in that area. In that area. So, as an example, let's take a quick look at this article. It's about a particular city where the Chevron company actually purchased a and created their own quote unquote news site for it. And if you read or listen to this story, you'll see that they talk about what's going on in this particular town in California, where they where the people living there can't get the full story of what's going on. And so what happens is or what happened, I should say, is the primary local news source, the Richmond Standard, was actually found out to not be a real news source. It was more of a PR company running the organization for Chevron. Okay, now that we've talked about news deserts and a news mirage versus actual news stories, let's look at some of the less traditional formats you might encounter or you might want to use yourself when you're reporting. And the first one is podcasts. We also have something called poet or musical journalism. Comedic news coverage is another one, and also what we're calling an interview with a twist. So, something that's a little different from a traditional news interview. So, up first, let's talk about podcasts. Now, what is a podcast? Well, first, the word podcast is a combination of the term iPod and the word broadcast. So those two elements were put together and created podcast. And a podcast is an on demand, on the go medium. So it's something that isn't, sometimes they do include some rehashed over the air stories, but really a real podcast is going to be something that is created to be consumed on demand, to be heard whenever a listener feels like listening to it. And these can be audio only. They started that way, but now you'll notice on YouTube there are a lot of audio video ones out there as well. And you can view them on other platforms as well. And now you don't have to actually download a podcast to listen to it. You can stream it, of course. And again, this is a bit different from something that is more on-demand content that was created as a kind of secondary item to the original broadcast. So again, a podcast is something that's created to be listened to on demand and streamed or downloaded somewhere. And these are often delivered using what's called RSS, really simple syndication. And hosting apps or services are usually utilized as well. So, something where you can upload the podcast and your audience can download or stream it. And sometimes a podcast will also have a website. So, while there are thousands of podcasts out there, more or less, we can group all of them into four different categories. First, the interview show. So, this would be things like the Joe Rogan Experience and Hot Ones, the roundtable panel style. And you'll see these for a lot of shows whenever a show is over, or sometimes while it's ongoing, there might be a panel discussion about the show, and that's used as a podcast to recap what's going on. You've seen it for Game of Thrones. The Walking Dead had an after show that was also broadcast on television. That was in more of this roundtable panel format where you're talking about ideas in addition to maybe asking more personal questions like you might hear on an interview show. And then we also have performance programs, and finally narrative fiction and nonfiction. And why might you choose a podcast as opposed to a traditional radio style? More than 3 million podcasts exist right now. So in 2025, and the average podcast receives about 27 listens per episode. Now, it's important to keep in mind this is somewhere between zero and that number on average. There are some shows who, if you look, they have very few audience members, either subscribers or people listening to episodes. So it's important to keep that in mind, and especially when you're working on engagement with your audience. And the top 1% of podcasts average about 3,200 plays per episode. Now, this is much smaller than the millions of views you might get if you're on a traditional broadcast network. So it really means that you aren't going to earn as much through advertising revenue, or if people are paying for it and stuff, paying for your podcast, then probably still a bit less than quite a bit less than what you're getting for another medium. And finally, we look at the most popular podcasts, the most popular ones tend to have often, but not always, they have a famous host. So someone who was famous before they started the podcast. However, some of them have people who were maybe considered like B or C list celebrities beforehand, or someone who maybe was known within their particular circle, but not as well outside of it. But interviews are normally included in the most popular podcasts as well. So, some podcast basics. You want to ask, why should someone listen to your podcast? And first of all, think about how you're informing your audience. You might include some common problems or current issues affecting your particular audience. And this is something you can think about too for other news formats as well. So, what kind of problems can you address for people? And this isn't necessarily a like global level problem type of situation. This could be something as simple as I don't know how to do laundry, or again, you could actually go into something more complex, especially if you're looking for material to use over multiple episodes. So maybe making kind of a mini documentary almost in there. Um, or you could talk about an issue people face, or something, basically something where you're giving your audience something in return for their time. And then you want to try and make it entertaining, of course. It's very easy for people to tune out, and they're more likely to as well within the first minute or a couple of minutes of a show. So try to keep them engaged and entertained. Think about what people love. Look at audience segmentation. Remember demographics, geographics, psychographics, behaviors. Those kinds of things can really help you to figure out who your target audience is and what they might enjoy. And then, of course, you want to be engaging as well. So think about your topics or the content that you're creating in an audience oriented way. Practice working on language like involving the audience by saying you or your. That can help to engage them a bit more in what you're talking about. Because remember, podcasts often are going to be at least 30 minutes, 20 or 30 minutes. Some of them are an hour long. Uh, there are occasions where they're even longer than an hour, but usually we're kind of tapping out at about that hour mark. So to keep someone interested through the whole show, so they'll actually stay and listen as opposed to going off and doing something else on their phone, by or choosing to listen to a different podcast partway through because they decided they aren't really they've heard enough and they're good. They want to do something else. And another way you can be engaging, of course, is to include thoughtful interviews. Uh, Go and look up things about the person you're interviewing if you have a planned interview in there. If you're talking about a topic, instead, make sure that you're familiar with the topic, you're familiar with the event, whatever it is that you're doing. So that way you can go in and ask more meaningful questions whenever you get there. Now, here are a couple of podcast examples. I have one from called Good Hang with Amy Poehler. So Amy Poehler is an actress. She was in Parks and Rec, and she was on SNL and a bunch of other things. So someone with a lot of experience being in front of the camera, which, of course, also in this case, especially, it makes her a good host. She's accustomed to having to ad lib with people too, which is a really great skill to have in a host. I can't play them for these YouTube videos, so you'll need to watch those on your own if you want to watch them. The second one is from a podcast called Ghost Town. So Ghost Town talks about different mysteries, different happenings and things, like the name implies, in kind of ghost haunted mansion type things. Okay, so we've talked a bit about podcasts. Let's move on to talking about poet journalism. So, what is poet journalism? Well, this term is rather new, even though the concept is actually quite old. If you go back and read parts of the translated works of the Iliad and the Odyssey, you can see there are some elements of this factual poetry happening in there as well. But again, this term, poet journalism, is fairly new. It was coined by the man you see on your screen, Aaron Dorkin of the University of Michigan. He was on President Obama's Arts Council. And the way he defined it, and a few other people who've also worked on this concept, is basically you're taking verified facts and using rhythm and meter to engage your audience and deliver those facts. So there, like I said, there have been other examples before the 2000s of the this idea of poet journalism. Some other similar structures you might explore are "Oh Captain, My Captain" by Walt Whitman and Alfred Lord Tennyson's "The Charge of the Light Brigade." Both of those are about real things that happened and were relatively, well, especially in the case of the Light Brigade, something that was very current as far as events go, but and on the mind of the audience who later read that poem. Now, here's a poet journalism example. So this one is more more of a limerick as opposed to a multi-paragraph poem. So it says, "This is, of course, for a reporter, most certain a question of order, and many a poet, wouldn't you know it, were not quite the biggest supporters." So, slightly longer example of the charge of the Light Brigade. This is a retelling of the Battle of Balaclava in 1854, which happened during the Crimean War. And whenever you listen to it, listen for the type of language that they're using. So it's very action oriented, very descriptive language. There is a little bit of poetic license that happens in here as well, especially when they have lines like "boldly they rode and well." And it's talking about a cavalry charge, and the and a lot of this language does tend to editorialize slightly, glorifying their deaths and this battle and everything. But also it does have some descriptions for the audience of what happened. They leave out specific numbers, but for your own edification, of the 660 members of the Light Brigade, 113 were killed, 134 were wounded, and another 45 were captured. I also read that about 180 of the Russians who were on the other side of this, so being attacked by the British Light Brigade, they were they lost about 180 people in that conflict. And essentially, what historians have decided is, or through their research and everything, is that essentially a miscommunication of orders led to this attack where a small light brigade, which you're usually supposed to have a heavy brigade follow up with them, the heavy brigade never came, and so the people who survived had to fight their way back to the rest of the infantry. And this highlight and the reason this kind of poetry can work as far as like being informative and everything is it's also a way to highlight humanity in a different type of language. So using something that's maybe a bit more descriptive and capable of encompassing the feeling of what's happening a bit more within the prose as opposed to or within the poem as opposed to the more traditional type of news writing with you know the kind of smaller paragraphs of information and direct quotes and things. So here's The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward, the light brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. They rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made! All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the light brigade, noble 600. Okay, so let's move on to talking about news in particular, another way of delivering news by using comedy. So, comedy and news, politics and comedy have existed together for centuries. There are even some pieces from ancient Greece that include poetry, that include politics and in the form of stage plays and comedies. So, the Acharnians by Aristophanes is one of the earliest examples, especially of comedy and politics being put together. And of course, we've continued with that tradition through the years. Uh, they started out, so the Acharnians is actually meant to be on stage, but we moved from working on stages to writings and drawings like the one that you see here. So the political cartoon pictured here is called Congress Embarked on Board the Ship Constitution of America, bound to Konogochek by way of Philadelphia. So that was from 1790, so not that long after the American Revolution. And if you look closely, you can see there are a lot of little speech bubbles coming out from the different people involved, and including people who are on the main ship here. And there's also a little devil luring the ship to the rocks as well. And this political cartoon is about it's commenting on the move of the United States Capitol from New York to Philadelphia. And of course, eventually we ended up creating Washington, D.C. to deal with all of the division issues in the country regarding like where should the capital be. But so this particular cartoon is commenting on the on how Philadelphia is going to make money from the move and how it was, political and monetary type thing. And, why don't we just leave it in New York kind of statement. So now we're kind of moving back to that political and societal commentary being more of a performance in our, modern video audio era, whether we're talking about something that's posted online or something that you're watching over the air or listening to over the air. And one of the reasons that comedy has stayed within this kind of news oriented talk show is because it really is a good way to connect viewers with certain types of news concepts. It's a way to inform someone sometimes. A lot more of them now tend to be biased in their delivery depending on who it is. Of course, it changes which biases we're discussing, but it is also a good way to get people thinking about issues, which does often lead to more serious traditional news viewing or serious discussions about what's going on. And in addition to using humor, of course, a comedy talk show will use things like either a stand up, a monologue with it. There are often guests on the show as well, or some of them do include skits too. So where they're acting out a particular thought process about this concept, whatever it is that they're discussing. So here are some links to a few different examples of comedy talk shows, and some of them are more like the first one. So this first one is it's from Conan O'Brien's podcast show. He does a series called Summer S'mores where people go and he invites, it's mainly his production staff, but he's had a few guests on it as well, where they'll go and talk about different things, occasionally serious things, but most of the time it's pretty silly. And for example, in this one, this is where Conan and his kind of co-host slash producer Sona start trash talking in the middle of playing cornhole in the backyard. So a lot of people who play cornhole, it's a way to connect them with the show and maybe get them engaged in some of the other episodes and other things that are going on in their programming. And then the next one is something that's a bit more of a traditional type of interview, except there tend to be a lot more snarky comments or jokes, or they'll include kind of weird but still relevant segments in the middle of a show. And then finally, we have the more traditional night show slash comedy talk show, Late Night with Seth Meyers. And it's a clip from there where he's talking about a an SNL Severance parody. So whenever we talk about an interview, what's involved in a traditional interview? Well, traditionally speaking, if you have someone and they're on your show as a guest or whatever, they usually have a product or something in their own life that they want to mention while they're there. So they often that's going to be one of the points brought up during the interview. However, if you're hosting a traditional interview on your show, you do want to make sure that your audience understands why the person is there. Like, why are they being interviewed? Why is this topic important? Or why are they on the show? Like, what's going on here? And then, of course, you want to provide context and direction as the host. So you can do this in a few different ways, but primarily you're looking at either possibly a more formal tone, especially if you have someone who has kind of difficulty being on air. um, this might be a better approach. Or if you're really good at getting people to relax, maybe a more conversational tone would be better. Something where you're able to give your listening audience more context, but also where you can kind of direct the conversation and make sure that the questions you need to ask are being answered as well. And here's an example of an edited interview in more of a personality profile type of situation. It's from CBS Mornings. They do a lot of really good longer content. And in this particular case, this is where they've interviewed someone else who is a TV host in their own right, Graham Norton, and they talked to him about his approach to hosting a show, and also they talk about a new book that he wrote and how it differs from his other styles of media engagement. So from traditional interview, we are now moving into interview with a twist. Well, what do I mean when I talk about a twist? A twist is something that is a little different, a little more off the wall than what you might see in a traditional interview with someone. For example, you could have an alternative setting. Maybe you always have your show next to a fireside. Um, or you like they had a show for a while that was, I think it was called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. And basically what they would do is the host would sit in the front seat and they would drive around with a with another comedian and talk about different topics, often about their show, the the person being interviewed about their own show or whatever it was that they had going on at that time. So alternative settings could be one. Not having an interviewer is another option. You'll notice this with some of the magazine based YouTube interview videos now, where they'll have kind of a pre-selected set of questions and they'll give those to whomever is supposed to be on the show, and they'll have them answer these questions, and they do have people who are managing producers or floor operators or stuff like that in there, but their audio never appears in the show instead, and they never appear on camera either. It's just the interviewee, the person who's being interviewed, who's on there. And they're also the ones who are usually reading these questions out loud for the listening audience. So, of course, also including pre-selected questions could be one way to twist it. So maybe reaching out to your audience and saying, "Hey, we have so and so who's coming on the show next week. Send us your questions, and we'll yours might be one that's read on air." So you kind of sort through different questions that people send in, or something like that, where it's it's a little more crowdsourced than maybe having a producer or reporter develop these questions all the time. And also there might be some games in there too. So having some kind of game included in the show as part of the both audience engagement, but making it more fun for the person you're interviewing too. And of course, a certain element of spontaneity could be in there as well, and is often important when you have these interview with a twist type shows, especially if you have one where you have a few different people who are guest starring on the show. So here's an example of one with internet sourced questions and no visible interviewer. And you can see that the at one point the cast actually does talk to the person behind the camera or next to the camera about some of the questions and things that are going on. So for this one is from Wired Magazine's YouTube page, and they're asking the Futurama cast some questions, some of the most Googled Futurama questions. So they, usually you'll see on, especially on some of the older Wired videos in this series, where they'll type in the first word of a show, like the name of the show or whatever, and they'll kind of show the fill in the blank of what people are including before or after that particular name. Now, first we feast the hot one, the host of Hot Ones. They The Hot One show, of course, if you're unfamiliar with it, it's one where the host and the guest both eat hot wings that increase in spiciness, and the idea is that so do the questions also get a bit spicier as the program moves on, and they'll include some social media deep dives from a person's page in there sometimes too, or from maybe an old interview if a clip from an old interview if it seems relevant. And of course, the idea is that the guest might might not be able to finish the interview if the wings start getting too spicy. And then the one after that is from Graham Norton. So, The Graham Norton Show. This is a British interview show that's been on for a really long time. This clip is actually an older clip, but they've re-released it recently, and it shows Colin Farrell interacting with an audience member. And this is one of those where it includes some pre-developed ideas. Like there's a woman in there who was selected from the audience to talk about when her she and her friends went out to a bar and she supposedly met Colin Farrell, and then afterward, and then this is a show with Colin Farrell on it, so she's talking to him, telling him about that, and and so it gets interesting, and you can see how there are a lot of possibilities when you do that kind of combination of looking up something interesting or unusual about someone and then asking them about it or including them in the program in that way. So here's a question for you. Are comedy and variety shows too close to entertainment to be called news? So I'll let you continue thinking about that. There really isn't a right or wrong answer for this one. It's more something to consider. Like, are comedy shows too close to entertainment to really have a substantial news element to them? Or is it something where it really does work as a gateway into other more traditional news ideas and news platforms? So we're seeing a lot more of that overlap between old and new media nowadays. Even with something like podcasts, the podcast concept is in terms of broadcasting and everything in general, still relatively new, even though it isn't a like brand new idea. Same thing with social media. It is older now than, of course, it was in the past, but is much newer than some of the other forms of media that you might use for a particular traditional news source. So you might consider developing a podcast or a TikTok or something in order for a traditional platform in order to reach new audiences and new sponsors. And why might this be a good idea? Well, about half of US adults have listened to podcasts in the past year. It's actually a bit more than half who have. And more talk show listeners are moving to the podcast format because they want to hear more about the topics they like without having to piece it together between all of these other sources or only have 5 minutes about a topic when they want to hear about it for an hour. And younger adults, like all of you, of course, are more likely to listen to podcasts than older media. And not to mention that all of us have phones nowadays. Some people use their tablets too whenever you're watching YouTube or looking at or listening to a podcast maybe while you're working on something else. So it is a very common way for people to receive news. and it's becoming more of the norm as opposed to a traditional broadcast or like television or radio. So, whenever you're working with a news group, whether you're working independently, like with developing your own shows and things, or working as a reporter for a larger group or a producer, you need money to make the news happen, right? So there are two different ways of doing it. The first one, commercial funding. This is where you're providing news in exchange for money from readers and or advertisers. Usually it's a combination of those two things, selling ads and either online or paper subscriptions. And that's often the most traditional way of doing it. Also, product placements within shows help quite a bit, especially if you're able to get a like one particularly well-known advertiser who wants to be your sponsor for your show. And whenever you're watching a video on YouTube or listening to a podcast, listen for how many times you'll hear about a particular product or service that month. Sometimes you'll notice, for example, with the company BetterHelp, they were sponsoring a whole bunch of podcasts over a 4 month period. So 4 to 6 month period. So they bought a bunch of ad space at a particular time of year, and that kind of fundraising can be helpful, but it's also a good idea to look and see how that breaks down as far as how much money are you actually getting for producing the show. And it might be that you need to include some kind of additional commercial funding to really make it work. And that could be something like a Substack subscription, Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, Kickstarter. Any of those are some of the newer crowdfunding options that can happen. And some of those can also work for the next type of funding we're discussing, which is nonprofit funding. Now, one of the biggest differences is this means that you're providing news as an educational public service instead of officially giving someone for example, if you're a newspaper, allowing them to view your blocked content because they gave you money. Instead, when we talk about nonprofits, this means that their primary goal is to educate the public. And there are a lot of different grants out there that pay for part of these nonprofit groups. They usually hold some kind of fundraiser as well. Again, that could be something where you're collecting money using a Patreon account, so getting subscribers, kind of subscribers, but not really subscribers, since again, we're really just fundraising instead of providing a good or service. And then you might you might need to look for larger private donations as well. And again, while you'll notice for a lot of fundraisers that people do also include gifts in there. Now, the difference, of course, is that this is a supposed to be a gift for contributing money to this particular program, this particular educational public service, as opposed to receiving a good that you're paying for. So in it's a small but very significant change in the way you're looking at what's happening. And whenever we talk about tax exempt organizations, again, educational groups can fall under that category. Charitable, religious, or scientific groups are some of the other larger tax exempt brackets. And most of these you work with something you'll see this a lot on websites too. If you look at something here, it says it's a 501c3 organization. That is a particular internal revenue code. So it means that they have very strict guidelines about how they can raise money, what they can do, can they what they can mention on air, or what you can publish or do when regarding the money that's being received from other people. And I have a few nonprofit news examples on here. KRVS is one of them. Verite News in New Orleans is too, and so is the Current LA, and that's the Current, which is a Lafayette-based nonprofit news group. Now, like I said, there are some limitations if you go the nonprofit route, and here are a few of them. First, you may not attempt to influence legislation. So it can't be a lobbying group, basically, and it can't be a campaign group. So you can't use the money for campaigning. And the earnings can't benefit private shareholders or individuals. So that one is another biggie. You can't, whenever you are receiving donations from people as a nonprofit, you can't then take that money and distribute it to people who are considered shareholders within the group. You're taking that money to continue operations, not to pay, not for like dividend payouts and stuff. And then you also want to spend the money for the proposed charitable reason. That means you can't just call yourself a charity and then buy a luxury vehicle or something. You need to prove that you are spending the money pursuing the proposed charitable reasons. And again, in the case of a news organization, this would probably be defined in some way as educating the public. Okay, so that's it. Make sure that you go back and read chapter 6, look at some of the key terms and information in there. And if you have time, also listen to the examples that I posted here. I found them pretty entertaining, and I think you'll at least find a couple of them to be pretty, worth the listen as well. All right, that's it, and you have a great one.